Okay, good evening all, and apologies, some technical glitches this evening because we've got an upgraded version of Microsoft Teams, and I suppose never do live television with children, animals, or new software. So our apologies. The other thing is that unfortunately, Des Winter has been caught on the other side of the barrier and has not been able to join us as a presenter. The benefit of this new upgrade, I'm told, is that it facilitates the presentations and allows a much wider audience to participate. So it's been a relatively busy week. I think the major issues really have been along the reintroduction of surgical services and trying with the surgical programs interacting or interfacing with the Department of Health and the HSE to come up with pathways that may help the reintroduction of surgical services. It's going to be a very difficult issue, and I think we're facing much greater difficulty than we have in dealing with the acute effects of COVID, where essentially we reverted to dealing with acute care and emergency care. And now, on top of a very large waiting list across all disciplines and across all parts of the country, we now have 3 months of deferred workload, plus the day-to-day ongoing needs of the health service. And it will take us months, if not years, if we're not efficient to address this. So this is going to be the major item, I think, that's going to occupy us over coming months: reintroduction of a safe, timely, and equitable healthcare. The second issue that's been occupying us this week is, and will continue to, I think, take a high profile, is concern about training. And so many of our trainees have lost training opportunities in the last 3 months. Now we are doing our very best to make sure that progression is not impeded. And today I had a meeting with the other 3 presidents of the Royal Colleges, and we're trying our best to see how training can be protected. That if in the new normal, if cases are being sent to private institutions, that we must try to ensure that trainees get training opportunities in those private institutions. So the NTPF as was served a purpose, but it is not fit for the current needs and will need to be adapted so that our trainees can train. And then there are the difficulties about examinations in the autumn, and the question is how we deliver a clinical examination with social distancing, or whether we have to change the format of the examinations. Changing format of examinations is fraught with difficulties. Without due notice to trainees, it would be unfair. Equally, the regulator, the GMC in the UK and the Irish Medical Council here, need to approve any changes in our examinations. And then if you change the exam, can you change back to the old format? So there are considerable challenges in the background. So that's, I suppose, what's been occupying me for much of my week. And so it is a welcome relief to talk about a completely different subject, and that is surgical research in a COVID-19 era. Our first speaker is Ronan Cahill, Professor of Surgery at the Mater Hospital and UCD. And I've had the great privilege of seeing some of the work that Ronan has been doing, and I'm sure he will share it with you. And if you get to see some of the videos, if you haven't seen it on prime time, you'll see them now, I hope. And it really is most interesting work, and I think has potential for application in terms of new device development, and maybe Ronan will talk about that. And then Claire Donoghue, will talk to us about a broader perspective on surgical research and how it might be affected in the COVID-19 era. Claire is upper GI surgeon at St. James's. I had the great pleasure of having Claire work with me as an SHO not so long ago, and she is just about to come back from maternity leave, so we'll welcome her. But we're going to start with Ronan Cahill, and so Erica, if I can hand over to Ronan, I'd be pleased to do so.
So thank you. Oh, let's see, 1 minute. So Ronan, thank you very much for the introduction and congratulations on starting your presidency. Kieran and Erica, thank you for setting this up. I hope you can see my slide, which I'm going to start now. So, I mean, I think everyone knows that surgery has been hugely challenged by COVID-19, and the Intercollegiate College advice cautioned against using minimally invasive operations because of the aerosolization hazard. And this caused a lot of, I think, frustration from people. And some of the guidelines have changed a bit, but mostly still concentrating on smoke management in surgery. But I mean, this was clearly a huge step. Minimally invasive surgery is often the gold standard. It's been part of our landscape for the last 30 years. And it was a huge thing to think that it could be undermined and even not used in the patient's interests because of infection risk between the patient and the operative team. So we wanted to try and understand this a bit better and to look at it. So we undertook a series of works in the last couple of weeks. So what we're seeing here is a near-infrared camera that's specifically attuned to carbon dioxide. So you can see the heat signals from operative teams in the background, but the smoke you'll see in the front is carbon dioxide. It's a cooled filter that just shows carbon dioxide. And you'll see here in this laparoscopic pelvic cyst operation that there's really quite a lot of smoke moving all around the operative team. So we kind of know this, but now we're showing it. When you put a trocar into a pneumoperitoneum, gas leaks out. There's different styles of trocars in different ways, but putting access channels into people will leak gas. It can leak at the base of the ports or at the top of the ports. Even with the valved trocars, every time you put an instrument in or out, you get that little jet of gases coming in and out. And the air seal device is particularly interesting. You see it acts as a chimney with carbon dioxide coming out a lot during the cases. A lot of instruments have. Can I interrupt for a
second? I think there's a technical problem here because I don't know about your screen, but I can't see any of your videos, and I only have 9 people currently in the meeting, which is the antechamber that we were talking about. I've just talked to Kieran Ryan, and there are 50-something other people in another meeting room.
Okay.
So Kieran is going to talk to Erica and see what we can do to adjust this. But so I'm sorry, but there's little point in continuing just at the minute unless we can sort this technical issue.
Oh, there's Des.
Yeah, I think it's Des Winter here. I think it's just us on this.
Oh, good afternoon, Des.
Good afternoon. It took a while to log in. Sorry about that. I'm showing my age.
Well, we're only going to show you this one more time, Des.
I think the problem is the Microsoft thingy. If you're logged in on your computer already under your own name, it's hard to do under the RCSI thing. No, not to worry. We got there in the end. I worked it out eventually with Erica's help.
Well, the problem is we're all in the antechamber. And the main audience is in another room, and we're not connected.
Sorry, Ronan, just to let you know, you'll only see us in the bottom section, but everyone else is attending the event as an attendee, so they will all be able to hear and see what's on the live screen.
All right, well then we were not seeing anything Ronan Cahill was...
Is Ronan sharing his slides? He was sharing his slides there.
I was.
Do you want us to share your slides for you, Ronan?
Well, I'm sharing them here. If you think people
I can see them.
Well, I certainly can't. If anybody else can, let me know.
I got a text from one of the trainees there to say they can see and hear.
Okay, well then it's just me. All right, crack on then.
Okay, well, so we were talking about, or looking at carbon dioxide leaks during operations, and we got to the point of talking about that a lot of instruments we use have hollow spaces in their shafts because wires go up and down the channels of instruments. And you see here the ligature device being used, causing gas leaks as it goes in and out of the trocar. But look at it also up at the handle. There's quite a bit of smoke that's coming out. So any instrument that has a hollow space in it is going to leak gas up and out. Valve fatigue is another problem. Sometimes you see this after as soon as 3 or 4 instrument insertions. And if you haven't fully emptied the abdomen, you will still get some gas leakage coming out of it. So this shows a lot about where the guidance about being careful and mindful in the technique has come from. But not everything can be dealt with just by being careful. And clearly some of these things are inbuilt mechanical aspects of it. Here's a robotic case. This is a robotic assisted prostatectomy. And you'll see again that these instruments, which have a lot of spaces in them to let the levers go up and down, and the energy transmission also leak quite a bit of gas continuously during the case. And although the surgeon is sitting remote from the patient, of course, the scrub nurse and the assistant is sitting within these plumes of gas coming out the back of the instruments. This is carbon dioxide, which here's the air seal. This is a particularly interesting device because you see the valveless trocar being used in air seal mode, and you see there's quite a lot of gas comes out the top of it, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But lots of the things we do in laparoscopic accesses require us to disrupt the valves to get an instrument in or out, and gas leaks. Anything like a robotic procedure will have all the same risks as a standard laparoscopic procedure, so putting clips in and out can also cause quite a bit of gas coming out of it. Now we know that this doesn't necessarily mean that there's a transmission risk of COVID-19. There have been variants found in blood, in stool, maybe in the peritoneal fluid, but that's not to say this necessarily carries a risk of infection. It just shows the mechanism of how aerosolization can happen at operations. This is transanal minimally invasive surgery. The access channels will leak, the instruments coming in and out. But you'll also see intermittently belching coming from the area where the gel cap is attached to the patient. And here the surgeon's face is probably much closer to the site of operative access. That's a belch happening around, bringing out intrarectal gas into the operating room. And a lot of people use the air seal also in transanal operations to give a stable pneumorectum to allow the operation happening. So the air seal I think is particularly interesting. You see here the chimney of carbon dioxide coming up and out of it. And the key question is whether this is coming from the tubing or is there a lot of intra-abdominal gas in it. So we've looked at this. Just seems like someone else has started sharing my slides now. Could I get them back?
Ronan, no one else is sharing your slides. I think if you just try it again for yourself.
Sure, okay. So to see was the gas that comes out of the air seal intra-abdominal or not. This is a nebulized gas model. So we filled up a surgical model with humidified gas and then look to see does it come out the top of the air seal trocar. So you see the gas moving up here, and as you remove the laparoscope from it and use a trans-illumination technique in a darkened room, you see a lot of humidified gas coming out. So some of this carbon dioxide plume is definitely coming from within the patient. The second thing about air seals is that they suck air into the abdomen. So this is the air seal device in air seal mode. There's a suction here going through a different port, And you see that plume, that chimney of gas has disappeared. And what's happening is it's sucking room air into the valveless trocar. I'm going to show you how we know that for sure just in a moment. But you see, every time we suck, it disappears, and every time we stop sucking, the gas comes back. So this is a flow meter held just outside the trocar, and you see that it's putting out about 1 litre of carbon dioxide every minute. Looking at this, here's a suction, and what's going to happen is when we suck here, you'll see the flow reverses its direction. We'll move to a minus figure, and it goes up to 7 litres per minute coming in. I mean, I guess of course it does. You'll see that these type of suckers take about 50 litres of gas out per minute, but you'll see when it sucks, there isn't a compensatory increase in flow in the air seal, but yet the pneumoperitoneum pressure has stayed the same. So it's definitely sucking room air in to maintain the pneumoperitoneum. So to look a little more objectively at some of the gas leaks, we've used what's called a sclerin imaging device. The carbon dioxide camera is pretty good just for qualitative assessments, but doesn't allow you to quantify it. So this is a way of looking objectively at optical gas densities. And we think that you can think about leaks in gases maybe in 3 different ways. One is the ones that we deliberately do. So when you vent to let smoke out, when you take a trocar out while pneumoperitoneum is still there, these are choices that the surgeon makes, and then of course they leak gas. And by being more mindful about our practices, of course we can reduce these type of things. Inadvertent leaks are a bit trickier. I mean, we can say make a perfect incision just to put the trocar in and have no leak around it, but it's terribly difficult to do that. For each of 4 or 5 different trocars, for each of a different case. Sorry, now I just clicked out of that. So inadvertent ones are very hard for people to be perfect with. It's a very high standard to hold people to expect a perfect technique all the time. And also some stretching of the skin of the abdominal wall can occur during the case, particularly if you're using the instruments in quite extreme motions to it. So you can't really hang it all on the surgeon to deal with this category of leaks. The trickier ones, though, are the ones that really are part of the technology that we're using. So this is a port put into pneumoperitoneum. The obturator's been taken out, and you'll see that there's a leak of gas there. There's only 2 valves in a laparoscopic trocar. Perhaps there should be 3, but these are ones that are going to happen with the current use of instruments that we have. Here's a Hassan port. The applied medical Hassan is a hollow channel down the middle with some little holes in it. So every time you put one of them in, there's going to be a lot of gas leaking out. There's never been a big reason, I guess, to deal with carbon dioxide leaks before that, but the stark context of the global pandemic really has, I think, shines a light on a lot of these aspects. Here's an optical trocar. Of course, only gas in the person can carry an infection risk, but once the trocar is placed into the abdomen, that gas will all start coming out here. That's how optical access techniques work. And every time you put an instrument in or out of the trocar, you will get that little characteristic spurt of gas, which I think anyone who does operations will even hear or recognize the sound of it, a little psh, psh, as you put the instrument in or out. This is a very simple way to show you that instruments will leak gas. Here we're putting just a rubber glove around the top of a robotic instrument. Here I think it's the scissors. We're going to apply a positive pressure to the instrument tip, and you'll see how the glove distends. So with just a gentle blowing at the instrument tip space, you'll see the glove will inflate. So there's a lot of hollow space within instruments that gas can move up and through. And you see it leaks back out again. Once we take away the pressure inflation, the glove deflates again. To try and see a bit more closely where that leak is coming from, you can submerge the tip of the instrument, and again, just a gentle positive pressure on the tip of the instrument, you'll see quite a degree of gas bubbling from all different sites around the instrument head. Now, some of these will be blocked by apposition on mounting into the robot, but they're never intended to be hermetic seals. And I think that shows why you get the gas leaking around it. Here again is this nebulized gas model to show that not only is it just gas leaking, but that water droplets, this is a 1 to 5 micron mist inserted into the abdomen, so that these gas jets can certainly carry these water droplets up and into the room. Showing all the same ways that we've just seen in the last couple of minutes of looking in clinical and experimental cases. Now, the good thing about a sclerin technology is that you can quantify things, the velocity of flow, the volumes that are coming out, and you can map the trajectory of particles beyond just what we're able to see, because all we're doing is seeing gas. Once it dilutes within the room, you'll stop seeing the gas, but the movement of the particles will still keep moving to it. So you're able to do quantitative studies on it, and you're able to move to computer modeling to start to map out some of the particle trajectories. So by doing that, these are the estimated gas leaks levels that are occurring with these type of movements during the operation. Now, to talk about liters per minute isn't quite right, that some of these things only last maybe half a second or a second, but you can see in the median flow rates, things like instrument insertion or withdrawal, you can get up to a 20 litre per minute leak. And this explains, I think, in some way, the fact that we know that an abdomen needs 3 to 5 litres of volume to distend it, but yet the ongoing gas need during an operation is 200 to 400 milliliters per minute. Some of that is absorbed, about maybe 10% of it, 40 mils per minute, is absorbed systemically. But the rest of the gas use, for a cancer case, the gas use can be maybe 200 to 300 liters per hour. It's explained by these gas leaks. The Reynolds number is a measure of turbulence. It starts as a laminar flow going through a trocar, but once it moves into the atmosphere, it becomes turbulent, and that's going to have quite a big effect on the on particle movement in it. So what do you do about this? Well, one thing we've looked at with Darragh O'Keefe and Oscar Traynor is, should we be wearing a higher degree of personal protective equipment? So this is PAPR, so these are powered purifying air respirators, but that can only ever be a stopgap, because really you need to solve the issue more fundamentally. I mean, you could put a cage on the abdomen to maintain all the gases in that and protect the room from it, but this is a bit stupid, because you can't really use your instruments or place the ports where you want to do it. So to try and think about how those trocars could be managed, we've been trying to look at the effects of local suctioning on the trocars. So if we know how much gas is coming out, a few liters per minute, we know we can suck this away. Can you eliminate these gas leaks or manage them by placing ring suctions onto the trocars? This is a rather big one, but you can miniaturize these rings down and mount them at least on top and at the bottom of trocars right now. Ideally, you want to get them built into it, but for now anyway, a universal add-on is maybe what we most need. So how that looks like is this. So here you see the leak happening at the base of the trocar. There's a ring down there, and if we switch the ring on, you see that gas then disappears. And you can also have it at the top of the trocar. The one on the right is the control. There's no ring suction on that. The one in the center has a ring suction on the top of it. You can switch it on or off and show that the gas leaks are managed to it. So we think that there's no reason to be upset about gas leaks. We didn't really have a reason to deal with them before. Carbon dioxide has been cheap and easy, but really with this pandemic and with any others that are going to come, we can't just continue to close operating or doing the best thing for the patient. And we're really going to need to address this problem. I think anyone who sees these type of pictures will probably come up with some solutions themselves. So it'd be really fantastic if anyone has any ideas, would like to work on how best to deal with this. We would love to hear from it, of course. So really interested in what people's thoughts might be. and really happy to have this chance to show this to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ronan. That's really extraordinary work and very timely. But as I said at the introduction, it really does give us the potential for working with industry, and you're to be congratulated on your prescience and ambition in this. I guess, Kieran, we will take the chat at the end, and people can text in on the chat function questions, and then we can have a kind of a question and answer session at the end. But I'd like now to ask Claire if she'd like to take the mic and to talk to us about what her thoughts are on research in the current environment. Claire, you need to unmute.
I think I'm unmuted now, hopefully. So I think, thanks, Paul, you're going to run my slides for me, so I'll just ask you to move on as the time comes. So thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion today, and congratulations to Professor O'Connell on his presidency. So if you move on to the next slide, Paul. I just wanted to share some personal observations and thoughts on how global pandemics change the landscape for people and society, and how that might affect research. I suppose if you can just move on to the next slide there, Paula.
Erica, who's got control of the slides?
I'm just putting them up now.
Thank you.
Anyway, I'll continue to talk, I suppose, since the visual doesn't necessarily have to come up straight away. So I suppose what global pandemics do, if anything, given the rapidity of their spread, is that they emphasise how interconnected we all are as a society, particularly in modern times. That really the flap of a butterfly's wing in Beijing can contribute to a tornado in Kansas, and that's the image that would show on my slide if it were up. Many of the previous global pandemics have had significant impacts on human society, from the substantial mortality rates that are associated with it. And I suppose that ultimately causes society to ponder larger questions about life and how things work for us. Great, so if you move on to the third slide then, Paula. So when an entirely new disease emerges that sets the research paradigm really into overdrive, I suppose it immediately highlights how much we don't know and causes us to question previous assumptions. And then if we move on to the next one. So we've seen the consequences of having no or very poor quality information in the public domain during this current pandemic. There's a rush to fill the information vacuum, and I'm sure I wasn't the only person who was receiving daily chains of messages on WhatsApp about how you could cure the virus with hot water and with ibuprofen. So if we move on to the next slide. As Des will probably mention, we can also see that it's really stimulated people to think more and to write more and more and more. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see as of last night that there were about 11,000 indexed and peer-reviewed papers already on PubMed for this COVID-19 disease, a disease that really didn't exist until 6 months ago. So moving on to the next slide, my thesis for today is really that we can learn from the historic pandemic events that have happened, that history doesn't repeat itself, but that it does rhyme. And I think that we see patterns from the disruption related to previous global pandemics. So moving on to the next slide, my thesis is that pandemics expose previous fault lines in society and that they accelerate changes that are about to happen and bring them forward to us. So moving on to the next slide, we can see that we've been here before in terms of global pandemics. This is an infographic on, I suppose, the size of death tolls related to previous pandemics. For example, the large one there is the Black Death bubonic plague, which resulted in the loss of about 30 to 50% of the existing European population at that time who died from the plague. Then moving on to the next slide, we can see a map of the Byzantine Empire. This is in the time just before the Justinian plague. So if you look at the red line that goes all the way around the Mediterranean, this was the extent of the empire right at the time of that pandemic. And then subsequently it led to collapse essentially of the the empire. Historians think that some of the drivers of change were that the shutdown resulted in cessation of trade across the empire, and that caused weakening of economic and social ties, and that ultimately ended up leading to not only the collapse of this empire, but the Dark Ages throughout Europe. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that during the Black Death, the fear of the medieval world was compounded by its ignorance. They didn't know the cause of the plague, but they had a sense that it was coming from the east and it was related to trade, and nor did they know how to ameliorate it, so they blamed it on God's wrath. Essentially what happened was fear spread. There were pogroms against Jewish communities across Europe, and then there was a collapse of the serfdom and feudalism society that existed beforehand, because there were so few people left alive that there was more opportunities for the remaining serfs to work and to move to urban areas. So moving on to the next slide, we see that since the disease, causing Black Death, was thought to have originated from China, trade along the Silk Route essentially stopped again during this pandemic, and there was a resulting move to new technologies and new ways of trying to solve problems. Moving on to the next image, we can see Christopher Columbus setting off on his voyage to find new trade routes using new technologies involving shipping and travel on the sea. And his immediate aim was to try to find a new trade route to the east, which actually resulted in him stumbling across the Americas, which was unexpected for them in between. And moving forward, then the consequences of the arrival of white Europeans were substantial to the previously existing Native American populations. Here we can see there's a dramatic population collapse related to lack of immunity to this new diseases that white settlers brought, and this set up the conditions for the creation of the United States as a country, and also the conditions under which transatlantic slavery thrived. So moving on to the next slide, the most recent global pandemic prior to the current one was the Spanish flu, which set off the changes that resulted in the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of innovation, the spread of capitalism, and ultimately the Great Depression ended that decade and resulted in the New Deal paradigm having to rescue society. So moving on to the next slide, so we can see, I suppose, from all of these examples that there's a revolving nature of history. Pandemics seem to happen, trade ceases, old orders collapse, and new technological advances rise up in their place. So moving on, we can see that the common thread is that pandemics demand a refocused fundamental priorities, and what was previously short-term and thought to be critically is reprioritised by what is fundamentally urgent. And if we move to the next slide, we can see again that global pandemics expose fault lines in society and accelerate changes. So moving on to this COVID pandemic, from an academic publishing perspective, we've already seen the rush to publish, and I doubt many of these 11,000 papers indexed so far are of the quality that will lead to practice change. See on the next slide, we'll see the exposed fault line is that in the healthcare arena, we are submerged under a deluge of data, and we really do need a new paradigm to rise in order to stay up to date and keep abreast of developments. We see on the next slide that in this pandemic, our interconnectedness has been able to accelerate dissemination activities via social media and other platforms. And so there's an acceleration of changes that are already happening in the academic arena. And as we move on to the next slide, we see that this exposes another fault line. Although papers get widespread attention through social media, engagement and really understanding the data, I think, probably suffers from the superficial attention that happens. And this has been most vividly demonstrated, I suppose, really in the failure of the peer review process. This is a process I think has been struggling for the last decade to keep abreast of the huge increase in data and publishing that's happened. And now under pandemic conditions, we see the rush to the novel and the ability of this company, Surgisphere, which is an unheard of entity that we're able to publish database studies of dubious provenance in our premier medical journals. And that was unchecked and unfounded by the net of peer review until the data then reached the public domain. And we can also see through social media other downsides. Pile-ons happen very quickly, and there's a tendency for any mistakes made by academics to equate with the failure of all expertise and not just an individual mistake. So moving on, another great example, I think, of the acceleration of changes that we see during pandemic situations is the use of technology and connectedness for collaboration. The next slide shows us some of the data from the COVID surge collaboration led out of the UK, which I think is a great example of gathering really impactful data in almost real-time circumstances, and they had really eye-catching results that gave me certainly pause for thought. We can see on the next slide that the COVID Surge project is run by the UK-based NIHR-funded Global Health Research Unit, which is based out of the University of Birmingham and Edinburgh. And this is a pre-existing network prior to the COVID pandemic emerging. They had already had great practice in running internationally collaborative studies, and so in a very short time they were able to be very responsive and deploy their pre-existing infrastructure and networks together. This really huge cohort from 73 different countries, 700 centres and over 24,000 patients to gather data on them. You've also deployed numerous dissemination tools like newsletters, webinars, emails, social media, and as well as the more traditional publication. And just yesterday they published a patient information leaflet that explained their findings for people right at the coalface who are about to undergo surgery. So on the next slide, I think this is not just because of great individual work by these teams, but also due to the pre-existing UK taxpayer supported infrastructure that exists within the NHS on a wider scale. They have newly established training programs for clinician scientists. They have regional clinical trial units that ensure streamlined approach to getting research started and completed, and they have specific funding for staff to spend time on research. The next slide brings me to reflect on the sense of urgency that arises when we see a global pandemic. We see the extent of our knowledge deficit. It was essentially complete. We knew nothing just a few weeks ago, and now, data is accruing by the hour. However, I think looking into the future, that although research on COVID itself is important, the natural history of infectious diseases like these tell us that this particular disease is more a short-term problem. So here you can see a model that was generated for a fictional disease called fictionitis. And you can set different OR rates, death rates, and immunity duration. So I set up the parameters to equate to what we roughly think COVID is like at the moment. And basically the model sets 5 people who are infected with this fictionitis into a community of 10,000 people, and models how soon it would take for herd immunity to arise. So if we move on to the next slide, if you let those 5 people circulate amongst people who have no immunity beforehand, and in a population of 10,000 people, you see that it takes a very short period of time actually to reach a herd immunity threshold, allowing unfettered access of people to people and having no lockdown situation. So obviously we have flattened the curve and we've gone into lockdown, but ultimately infectious diseases reach like these kind of diseases reach a herd immunity threshold at some point. So I can't see this era lasting more than 2 to 3 years. So moving on to the next slide, this is why I think that COVID-19 research is really more a lens through which we view the big pre-existing questions of surgical research that you see from Ronan Cahill's work. This is already a problem that existed. It was really just the COVID era that let us see it from a different angle. So some of the bigger questions that I now see differently myself due to the pandemic are about equity of access to surgery nationally and globally, about how people perceive and handle risks associated with surgery. COVID-19 hasn't changed the psychology of how we interpret risk, it just changed the odds ratio for people. It also leads to huge questions about how we diffuse innovation and make evidence-based changes to practice. All of these questions are fundamental to surgical research and are the big questions that we are currently trying to answer. So on the next slide, I think the prevailing social order is probably going to change because we are going to have a massive recession. You can see here, this is the Purchasing Managers Index, which is basically a marker of activity within the manufacturing and services sector, and these are data from the UK. You can see on the left-hand side of the slide the data that from the 2008-2009 recession shock that lasted for a couple of quarters before activity started to return, and you can see that we've already exceeded those norms. And this, can you imagine what a second or third wave is going to do to a potential recession? So moving on to the next slide, we're going to face, huge recession, which will cause us to have to reallocate scarce resources. Past pandemics have caused us to pause and to reevaluate what's important on a society basis. So I think probably consensus economic judgment at this time is that a stimulus is the correct way to restart economies in this kind of circumstance, and therefore there actually might be potentially more resource to build future investment in infrastructure. So moving on to the final few slides, I think our interconnectedness and the current technological advances that we've seen work so well during this pandemic give us the ability to answer bigger questions, but high quality research did not come cheaply. If I had a criticism of current Irish funding research structures, is probably that it asks us to dream big and to dream about practice changing research, but it doesn't really give us the resources to actually complete what we need in order to fulfill that dream. If like in past pandemics, we're going to reevaluate as a society what is important to us, we, I think as researchers, are well positioned to make our case about what's important to the Irish taxpayer. They now have a growing understanding of, I suppose, the importance of equity and access to healthcare and a system that actually functions for patients, the importance of well-trained expert health practitioners there to advise. And I think COVID-19 gives a really tangible way of explaining how research works, illustrating the value of research, how we go from no knowledge to answering the questions that we all have about life and about how disease works. But I suppose first we really need to get our house in order. We're a small nation, but we really have a shockingly poorly integrated system in our research infrastructure, and we don't collaborate historically very well. And I think the dichotomy between the service delivery of healthcare and research is a really false one. Everyday clinical practice should be subject to research and scrutiny as a routine. Research is not a nice, would like to have frill. It's actually fundamental to a functioning healthcare system, but this needs to be funded and resourced properly. You know, and part of the problem in the Irish setting has been the energy expended in terms of working in a poorly functioning service means that we're fighting to deliver current standards of care rather than delivering what will be the future standard of care. So just to conclude, in global pandemics, I think we've seen that fault lines are exposed and changes are accelerated. And I think that COVID research is really a lens through which we address the big questions in surgical research. They just shed a different angle or give us a different perspective on things. And to really answer these big questions, we're going to need a reimagination of what's possible, investment of resources in the infrastructure, and integration of research into our clinical practice. So thank you very much.
Well, Claire, that was extremely thoughtful, and thank you so much for that. And I sincerely hope that I see you had a text that you had, that won't be consigned to a waste bin, but that will find itself to be the 11,001 paper published. I really would urge you to put that together because it's a very thoughtful and insightful review. You'll be interested to know that one of my first things that I've done as incoming president of the college is to create a council research committee, so that we are going to really try and address these issues from a surgical aspect, looking not as RCSI, the university, but RCSI, the birthright of surgeons across the country, and that we're going to try and leverage the resources to be able to provide an infrastructure for all surgeons in training and across the breadth of the country, that we can address the type of things that you've raised. And I'm afraid you've just talked yourself probably into participating in another committee, but there you are. Can I move on and ask Des Winter, good friend, long-time colleague, somebody who I've admired and tried to persuade to do things over the years, and he's just become editor-in-chief of BJS, which is an extraordinary distinction. His work ethic and intellect are renowned. So Des, your thoughts please on where we are and where we're going.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me okay. You'll be delighted to hear that we changed the title of this fairly recently this afternoon, so I have no slides to bore you with, so that's good. But I'm going to share with you some thoughts, and being a journal editor does give you a bird's eye view. Claire, of course, is involved with BJS. Ronan has been involved with BJS, and Ronan Cahill is involved with colorectal disease. So we've all been journal editors, and we all get a sense of what happens. You get 2 to 3 months ahead of schedule of what people actually hear, what's actually published. So far we've probably had in the region of 200 to 300 submissions, believe it or not, since the beginning of the pandemic to BJS. And I wanted to share with you some of the sort of thoughts or insights that I might give you from that. The first is, as Ronan has alluded to, is surgical smoke has been with us for quite a long time. We know from the gynecology literature as long as 20 or 30 years ago that when they were burning off HPV-related cervical lesions, that the smoke contained HPV particles, and that those particles could travel as far as 2 meters, and that those particles were capable of infecting people, and indeed, at least in an in vitro setting, were capable of causing tumors. So we know that that is a possibility. We know that the virus causing COVID measures approximately 125 nanometers, if I'm correct, and therefore is actually larger than many of the particles of smoke that we have. Is trapped in some way by the surgical mask that we use, but it really only reduces the risk of exposure. It doesn't eliminate it by any means by using the standard equipment that we have. Or the analogy that one might use is in the 1980s, in the early 80s or mid to late 80s, when HIV was a huge problem and AIDS was a huge problem, and we really hadn't a good concept of how it was transmitted. Condoms were suggested, but we really had no idea whether or not that was or was not going to be something which was going to work. And I think we've now got a better idea that it reduces your risk, but certainly doesn't eliminate it. So surgical smoke and what we do with it is definitely a question. What we don't really know is there living viable SARS-CoV-2 virus in smoke, and is that something that's transmissible? As yet, that's going to come. Is it worse with diathermy? Is it worse with sealing devices, or is it worse with ultrasonic dissectors? Much of the literature on this is very conflicted as to which is better, which is worse. And I think the jury is probably still out on all of those, but that's certainly a research goal which is imminent. Fascinatingly, just to change tempo ever so slightly, and I thought of this as I was listening to Ronan and Claire there, it strikes me that what's happened is a major waterfall event for the world. I mean, this is like the meteor crashing and wiping out some dinosaurs in terms of the change in the atmosphere. We have dramatically reduced the movement of people, and with that, hopefully, the movement of the virus. Probably a little bit too late, because if you actually look at it, it spread not only from China, but it also spread from West Coast America long before it got to Europe. So it probably had both an East and Western movement to it. But with all of those, we're now going to see a fairly amazing disruption in the technology sector as to compensate for that movement of people. So no longer will there be the trade that requires people to move from place to place. With that, one hopes that we will see less infective disease transfer. But my God, the disruptive technology sector is going to be huge. And here we are having live webinars and things, and we're now going to have international meetings in this capacity. And it's going to change that sector entirely, completely. So there's an awful lot to be thankful for and a lot to be excited about in terms of the future, I think. Some of the interesting things that are happening out there, I think it's going to be a very interesting time for electrostatic aerosol precipitation. There's a number of companies that have these devices that can electrically charge the atmosphere inside the abdomen during laparoscopic surgery and get those smoke particles to hit the ground in the same way as I'm looking out at the clouds are doing exactly the same at the moment, and the rain is about to fall. I think that's going to be a really interesting possibility, particularly if we can show that getting rid of those large smoke particles actually causes them to fall. As Ronan alluded to, we've had a number of submissions from various parts of the world who have tried to test for the virus in bile, peritoneal fluid, blood, etc., and with somewhat variable responses. I think a lot of that may relate to the acuity of the tests that are available as yet. As we know, none of them are 100% accurate. One thing is for sure, a vaccine will come. It just will not come, as Claire mentioned, in time. It's hard to see how that's going to happen inside the 2 years that this pandemic is likely to rage for. And it is inevitable as a result of that we are, most of us, going to be exposed. So the big question for me is now two lovely words which have come together beautifully for me: surgical virology. I've asked someone to write on this for the journal. I think we've now entered this unprecedented era where we will have to do preoperative testing for patients. Currently, we're spending a lot of money doing swabs and actually measuring virus load. I can perceive a world where this will be a blood test, where potentially we will have the ability to say that antibodies actually do confer you with some degree of protection. The difficulty, of course, for that with surgeons is exactly the same for those of you who were around at the time. Many of us were asked to have HIV tests in the 1990s when I was a trainee, and we were advised by our insurance companies not to do so, because if we tested positive, we would not be able to work. So you had this very interesting duality. You had this conflict between the morality of whether or not one should have testing done, and yet what would happen to the individual. Now, of course, we have treatments. Now, of course, we have abilities to provide other mechanisms of workplace, etc. So that has now changed. But why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we routinely doing a HIV test, hepatitis testing, hepatitis C testing? In many respects, I'd rather have COVID-19 than I would have hepatitis C, which would potentially be a far more fatal problem for someone, even though I'm in my middle age. So I think we've entered this new phase of preoperative genomic testing, if you like. We're now going to be able to test people for these things. There is potentially a style or type of patient who is more genomically determined to get that severe COVID illness. It certainly looks like there are some societies that were affected more than others, and certainly potentially that there are some genetic profiles, if not racial profiles, which will be more affected than others. That also enters into a whole new world of surgical ethics as to what's appropriate, what's not. Do you do blanket testing, or do you do testing within certain communities only? The fact that surgical screening in this country for screening for surgical diseases has stopped is not, of course, due to the pandemic alone. There are other issues, some of which are legal, as I'm sure you're all aware in the background. But this, make no mistake, this stopping for 3 months in terms of screening and surgery is going to put us back almost a decade in terms of our ability to cure disease. It is estimated that in 200 countries approximately in the world, the COVID surge group that emanate out of Birmingham have identified that somewhere in the region of 28 million operations will not have happened in the 12 weeks that we've had to stop. And if you look at that, that is an extraordinary statistic. That's 2,500 operations per day. If you do mathematical modeling on that and ask yourself, how long would it take to catch up? Even if we worked on Saturdays, it would take more than 45 weeks to catch up with that. So in a realistic scenario, in an Irish context in particular, where we lack the ability to increase capacity, I suspect our waiting lists are going to be out the door for some time to come. The other consequences, of course, are in terms of human ones, are the changes in cancer therapy and adjuvant therapy, etc., that has happened as a result of this, the changes in patient management, and I think that that will have a major effect. That so-called second and third wave of disease, it should really be the research priority for me. It's not just containment of the virus, it's going to be what, in the name of God, can we do about all of those poor patients? I would like to see less funding for COVID in some respects, and actually more funding for non-COVID disease, because as many of you who are chasing funding at the moment are aware, there's probably less funding for non-COVID disease than there ever was before. And that is, I think, regrettable, because those diseases have not gone away despite this current challenge or problem. Finally, just as a final word, is what's going to be a fascinating question is what has been the impact of patients who are COVID positive, who at least have serology positive or antibody positive, what their effect on those outcomes? How many of them have had venous thrombosis problems, arterial thrombotic problems, have had surgical site infection problems, etc. What's certainly coming through the literature is people are coming in with a much more advanced disease. We're seeing appendicitis like they saw in the pre-antibiotic era. You know, the era that killed Crean and killed Harry Houdini. We're seeing a huge increase in the morbidity like we did see in the pre-antibiotic era. And yet we aren't necessarily seeing a change in the mortality. Much of what came out of Wuhan was a high mortality of patients that we probably would not have operated on. These were patients who had a predicted mortality of 90% or greater, and we probably would not have operated in such extreme circumstances. But the reality is patients who were COVID positive, some of them have had a bumpy ride post-operatively, but it didn't necessarily change their post-operative mortality, but by God, it changed their length of stay and it changed their morbidity. And that was also true of those who were COVID negative. So it was just simply the fact of the pandemic getting people coming in with advanced disease. We have started, the journal has had two things which are of interest to our young RCSI listeners, I hope. One is Young BJS, which I hope will stimulate grassroots research and interest in surgical publishing from students right across from trainees to young early faculty. Anyone is welcome to join. We have closing in on 1,000 members already so far from every continent and from in excess of 100 countries in the world, and you're all welcome to do so. You can either contact me directly or look through social media. There's lots of it there on the BJS website, etc. The other initiative which RCSI are involved with, and I'm grateful to Ronan and his colleagues in Porrick and others for doing that. I've also asked the same of the Royal College of Surgeons in England, Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and I'm proud to say that RCSI have been much faster out of the blocks than the others. I'm still waiting for a response from the others. But what we are doing is a BJS commission on COVID-19 and perioperative care in this post-COVID world that we now live in terms of setting out the research agendas, setting out the problems, the challenges in all of the various facets of life. Because there are certain aspects of surgery that have kept going, breast cancer being one of them, that has not been affected quite as much as others have, and yet they have had challenges getting to adjuvant therapy, and as I said, their screening has stopped. There are other aspects like vascular surgery, which has almost stopped completely in an elective sense. And the impact of that in terms of carotid endarterectomy, the impact on strokes, etc., is probably going to be pretty enormous. It's actually the benign disease that has suffered perhaps most of all, because we have focused, as we often do, on the emotive, on the oncology, cancer care. Meanwhile, we've actually perhaps forgotten that there are others which have just as much temporal urgency. I'm going to stop talking now at this point because we are going to go over time if we don't, and I do want to give Kieran and Ronan the chair to let us have a chat about all of this.
Thank you so much. Okay, I just need to mute there. Thank you so much for that. And I think those of you who've joined us, I think we've had 3 outstanding presentations. As always, Kieran is going to come back in now as the lead because Kieran has had questions sent in on the chat line, and so maybe Des and Ronan and Claire, you can have your mics on so that you can interact with them. Thanks.
Thanks, Ronan. Thanks everybody for some excellent presentations and thoughts on the current situation. So I'll just cut to a couple of questions from those that were tuned into our webinar tonight. An interesting question maybe for Ronan Cahill. What about the laminar flow type setup that we see the orthopedic theatres use, and what does that mean in terms of the gas leaks and flow and so on?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So, I mean, most of us work in a positive pressure room, but there's no direction to suction. You know, the air is leaving the room. The directional spurts are coming from the emission of the gases. And if you do smoke studies in a positive pressure room, there's stagnation around the patient because we all stand around the patient, and that blocks some of that ventilation. So I think certainly there can be contamination of the room despite this. And if you move to negative pressure, maybe that's better. Well, that's an enormous infrastructural change. You can't just switch your positive pressure theatre to a negative pressure one. And, you know, maybe that might work a little bit better, but it's a huge thing to try and do.
My understanding, Kieran, my understanding of places that do that even, where they have the luxury of those negative pressure ventilated rooms, is that they still need 20 or 30 minutes between cases. So not only do you need infrastructural changes, you also need to slow down changes which would cripple the Irish system. We'd have to build new operating theatre. We need to build new hospitals to do this properly.
I think it's a fair point, but the challenge, of course, we see right now is that there's, and it's not in different specialties, the area of aerosolization of their procedure is different, and our ENT colleagues are clearly probably most affected maybe by many procedures in this area. That what's the cost of not doing work? What's the cost of actually allowing work go on, and the cost of PPE and so on? And maybe there is some just significant construction level type investment needed now in our theatres. Maybe when we start thinking of elective hospitals and so on, we need to start thinking about the actual design of this area. It would seem to show that this is something we need to consider.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, we're grappling with the idea of a children's hospital, which is going to be probably the most expensive hospital in the world. I predict, if it hits over 2 billion. I mean, when you look to see the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne, if you look at the new Karolinska Institute, they were built for far less than that, and they were magnificent buildings. So when you grapple and realise that that's hard enough to do in itself, yeah, there's an awful lot to be said for elective and emergency surgery being segregated. One of the joys of working on a Vincent's campus actually is that we have that luxury of being able for public patients to segregate emergency care from major cancer care, from elective surgical care for the smaller procedures to different places. Regrettably though, we are stuck in infrastructure which was built in the last century. You can update it, but it's nowhere near good enough. And the technology that Ronan is showing to you this evening just shows how far behind we are in terms of those technological advances. What can I ever see a time when we're walking around like they do in Intel, where they're making little microchips and things, where we're wearing hazmat gear and negative pressure environment? I don't know how realistic that is in terms of the cost and expense. I don't know if we can afford that, but by God, we need to think about moving in a direction which at least goes that way, and I applaud Ronan for his work in that regard.
I think though, Kieran, I think I'd caution against trying to make this too much of a first world solution. You know, this is, if you take the concept as Claire's talking about global surgery and DES, you know, this has to be solved everywhere in the world for surgery to advance. And I really quite like the idea of the closed circuit being within the patient. I think that's kind of something that laparoscopy can offer, without us having to put closed circuits around ourselves or turning the room into something that is only possible in very sophisticated healthcare systems. And I think, I mean, I think there's a lot we can do with simple mechanical adaptation to industry's advantage. You know, I think they should be all over this because they can make small changes and more expensive trocars. And I think that's kind of was a concept of laparoscopy in the 90s, that, you know, you could maybe reduce infection rates in Africa by keeping your operation in the abdomen. I think we can probably, I'd like to see that happen rather than just be something for Karolinska or, you know, one or two hospitals in Ireland to be able to afford in a decade's time. I think that's something really appealing about to me, that jugad type of innovation.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point and something to think about. Claire, you mentioned in your presentation an awful lot of discussion around the lack of proper surgical research infrastructure and supports. If you were sitting in front of the HRB or SFI right now, what would you ask them to do?
I think it's difficult for SFI and HRB because, I mean, ultimately the purse strings are held by the government, and they are only given a certain amount of money, and they do need to, you know, decide how much they can give. You know, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, I suppose, from a research point of view. In terms of infrastructure, you know, we've seen a situation where the NHS were, you know, very much behind, and the UK setting were very much behind what they needed to produce high quality research, and the investment came from the UK taxpayer, understanding that it would benefit patients not only in the healthcare system but actually benefit the economy as a whole. And I think that's part of how we get government to loosen their purse strings, is that this is you know, generates income ultimately if you put their infrastructure in the right place, and that starts ultimately with people. So I think the ICAP program is excellent in that we're going to have a new generation of clinician scientists, you know, who are able to integrate the training they need to become specialists in their area alongside the academic skills that they need in order to do it. So I think that infrastructure hopefully will continue on, so that when people are at my stage where you're trying to kind of set up your own research ideas, that there will be infrastructure to support that. And I think the other important aspect that we need to do better on is collaboration. So nationally we don't collaborate well enough. You know, there's lots of excellent minds in the country, but we're too busy, I think, doing our individual projects rather than getting on board with one, you know, one project at a time that can then, you know, actually answer bigger questions. And in a small country, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to work better together. And some of the infrastructure also, for example, from the UK setting, that you can see in terms of clinical trial units and streamlining, the mechanics of how you disseminate, how you gather data, how you store data, how you, think about ethical problems associated with it. All of that needs to be streamlined, and I think we're very much behind from that kind of basic infrastructure to bring us to the next level where we can really, reach out to the rest of the world to join with them.
I think that's great points, because Des and Ronan, you might want to comment here, because it leads on from that. You can see the power of the COVID-19 and the research, and Des, all the activity in the BJS and all the other journals, the COVID Surge project and their recent publications. It's been powerful because it's been collaborative, because it's been part of a network. And is that the call we need to start making to Irish surgery right now, is to think more as a total ecosystem, as opposed to individual all the time, and what we need to do to get that going.
Well, that's what I meant about the fact that we're no longer able to move doesn't stop ideas from moving, and ideas now move faster than ever. And that's really, if you read any of Steve Jobs' books, that's really how things actually change, is the connectivity of minds. So we now have, as Ronan Cahill was saying, we now have an impetus and a pressure point to put on industry for particular angles. As Claire says, we now have unprecedented energy around something like this. And as I was saying, where there's no movement of people, there'll be an increased movement of ideas. So the combination of all of that stands for a fantastic disruptive time, and wonderful new things will come from it, wonderful new ideas. And the college, as an entity, have a fantastic opportunity to be the lightning conductor for all of that fantastic energy, to get people working in those kind of collaborative ways together. I mean, the UK surgeons have led the world on how to do collaborative research, and they now do global stuff out of some of the smaller cities in the UK, which of course have embarrassed London hugely. And they really do magnificent work in those places. So there's absolutely no reason on earth why we can't do that. We've made some forays into the world of colorectal surgery, esophageal surgery, and of course there are others where we do lead some collaborative stuff out of this country. And it does show you that once you start thinking on a proper global scale, people are more than happy to be led even from a tiny island. Even though their volume is higher, it doesn't mean that their ability to think is higher, and their ability to put things together is higher. And sometimes just giving them a stage is a positive thing. Yeah. Regrettably, loads of people want to come to Dublin, but not anymore, unfortunately, due to the travel. But hopefully that'll get better again.
Ronan, you want to...
Yeah, just on that, Des, I mean, I think it's very timely that we're introducing this Council's Committee on Research. And as I set out at the beginning, it's not RCSI University research, it is surgical research across the country as the birthright of all of us who are members and fellows of the college. And so I think there is a tremendous opportunity to, as you say now, be the lightning conductor for these ideas. And I look to you guys to try and help us achieve that. I mean, you can look to what they have done out of Birmingham, particularly with the trials networks, starting very simply, but very quickly, becoming quite sophisticated and answering clinically important questions. You don't have to split the atom, but you probably need to be able to answer questions about common diseases and common problems and do it at scale.
Absolutely.
So we're coming up now 7:15, and I guess it's probably time to bring the proceedings for this evening to a close. I just want to thank all of our speakers, Claire, Ronan, Des, and our president, Professor O'Connell, and all of the team in Surgical Affairs that kind of pulled this webinar together. We had a few little difficulties at the start getting the new technology to work, but I think it got there in the end, and thanks for everyone's perseverance with that. So I think that was a lot of the final call, I guess, is that we have to start thinking collaboratively. We have to start thinking of the opportunities that everything this is now shown. There's going to be technologically and opportunities, There's going to be opportunities looking at the outcomes of patients and their surgical care. Interested in the whole idea of that surgical virology and the pre-op testing regime and the science that's got to be behind all the design of surgical activity now. That's got to be looked at. And then, of course, the college will probably, will get involved in supporting all of our units and getting a network going, and that's something to be very excited about. President, do you want to say something there?
Yeah, one last thing is to thank everyone. I think this has been, for me, the most exciting of the webinars that we've had, but that reveals my bias towards research and that. But I would ask those of you who are listening in and are interested in it, if you have comments, if you have ideas, please send them to us, because it's only through, as Des Winter has said, the exchange of ideas that we can really make this a reality. So thank you all very much.